our last lesson, we talked at great length about the Russian Civil War. Now that was a time of immense political crisis and turbulence throughout Russia. We learned that the Bolsheviks were being opposed by the non-Bolshevik groups that included the socialists, liberals, as well as the supporters of autocracy. Now, after Lenin's death in 1924, the Soviet revolutionary leader by the name of Joseph Stalin assumed power as the head of the newly formed USSR. In our last lesson, we learned how the USSR was formed in 1924. And after the death of Lenin, Stalin now became the head of the USSR. Now, Stalin took forward the socialist ideas to an even more extreme extent. So, in this lesson, what we will be focusing on is known as Stalinism. And by Stalinism, we refer to the iron rule of Stalin in Russia. And we will also be introduced to a new concept that is called collectivization. So let us now begin this discussion on Stalin, his rule, and the various policies he implemented in USSR. Now, Stalin wanted to boost the economy of the USSR. This is because many years of war, be that the First World War or the several years of continued revolution, had taken a severe toll on the Russian economy. And so, as the leader of the Soviet Union, it was upon Stalin to bring about changes and reforms in order to help the economy of USSR grow. And under Stalin, a series of centralized economic plans were introduced, and these were known as the 5-year plans. These 5-year plans were introduced in the Soviet Union from 1927, and these 5-year plans were to boost the country's economy. These 5-year plans had very specific goals. Each 5-year plan took care of certain things. So some 5-year plans might take care of agriculture, while other 5-year plans took care of industrialization. But all in all, these 5-year plans were centralized economic plans. These did not happen in isolation. These were introduced by the state and regulated by the state as well. Now let us briefly talk about the first two 5-year plans. The first two 5-year plans that happened between 1927 and 1932 and 1933 and 1938 helped rapid industrialization in Russia. Because under these two 5-year plans, many new industries and factories were springing up in Soviet Union. And these new factories were very essential to boost the country's economy, because the country's economy was already faltering. It was almost on the verge of collapse when Stalin had introduced the 5-year plans. But we are looking at only the positive sides of the 5-year plans. These were meant to achieve rapid industrialization, economic growth in the Soviet Union. But do you think these 5-year plans were all things good? Well, we will find that out in a while. But before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. When was the first 5-year plan introduced in Russia? Was it introduced in 1917, 1922, 1927 or in 1929? Well, the correct answer is 1927. These 5-year plans were introduced in the Soviet Union from 1927. Though these 5-year plans facilitated the growth of many industries and factories and helped the economic condition of the USSR also get better, the workers had to bear the cost incurred by the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union. Because the workers were at the base or at the foundation of these production units. And they had to spend very long hours in the factories and industries. So though these factories and industries created opportunities of employment for these people, these workers were overworked and often exploited at these factories and industries. They were not even paid well. So it were the workers and the laborers who had to bear the cost of rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union, which was triggered by the 5-year plans. Now, because of this reason, the living conditions of the workers deteriorated rapidly. They had to spend many hours in the factories or even work at the coal mines. Their health was put to jeopardy. And then they had to live in slum-like areas near the factories or the industrial units. So their living conditions deteriorated rapidly, and they had to provide labor for inhuman working conditions. They had to provide labor for very long hours because the state wanted to maximize the effectiveness or production of these factories and industries. And it became almost miserable and impossible for these people to toil for very long hours in inhuman conditions in the factories and industries as well as the mining regions. Now allow me to give you an example here so that you can understand the plight of these workers in Soviet Union. In a place called Magnitogorsk in Russia, a steel plant was constructed in a matter of only 3 years. So from this, I'm sure you are wondering how efficient these workers were so as to be able to construct a huge steel plant in only 3 hours. But let me tell you the real story. These workers had to work for even 15 hours a day. Can you imagine? Out of 24 hours in an entire day, they had to work for 15 hours so that the steel plant could be constructed at the earliest. And there were as many as 55 work stoppages right in the first few years because the workers were unable to toil in such inhuman working conditions. At the same time, winter in Russia is very bitter and severe because of the topographical location of this region. Russia is located quite close to the Arctic Circle, which is why winter is very bitter here. So these workers at the steel plant at Magnitogorsk had to climb down from the 4th floor, dash across the street in order to use the toilet. And let me tell you the temperature at which they had to go out on the streets. The temperature sometimes fell to as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius or even lower. So from this, I'm sure you have understood sufficiently how miserable the lives of these workers became when the 5-year plans were being implemented in the Soviet Union. Now the workers were at the foundation of the production units. In the Soviet Union, a new schooling system was also developed for these workers so that the workers and peasants could now enter universities. So can you understand how the workers were given utmost importance by the Soviet Union state? Because they helped rapid industrialization as well as many other changes throughout the state. But at the same time, it were these workers, these poor people who were exploited, who had to bear the brunt of the rapid industrialization in Soviet Russia. Now, creches were also made for the children of women workers, and model living quarters were also established, but unfortunately enough, the results of these plans were often unaccomplished because these creches where women were supposed to send their children when they went out to work, or these model living quarters that were established were not very successful in the long run. Having briefly talked about the 5-year plans that were introduced by Stalin, as well as the condition of the workers in Soviet Union, let us now focus on a very different line of discussion. Stalin believed that the kulaks hoarded stocks of grains. Now, who were these kulaks? These kulaks were wealthy landowners who possessed more than 8 acres of land. And Stalin believed that it were these kulaks who were hoarding stocks of grains. Now, why do you think did Stalin believe the kulaks did so? This is because Stalin was of the opinion that by hoarding grains, these kulaks used to increase the prices of the food grains during times of crisis and need. And it was because of this belief that Stalin now sent his officials to supervise the lands. At the same time, these officials were also supervising the collection of grains. And most important, these officials were given the power to raid the kulaks in 1928. And these kulaks were instantaneously thrown out of their lands. And this image here shows you how a peasant family is compelled to move away from their lands. So they had to instantaneously evict their lands. But these kulaks were not really responsible for the shortage of grains, for the increase of prices of food grains as Stalin believed. Now, during this time, Stalin was all set to boast economic prosperity in Soviet Union. He also wanted to produce more and more food grains. But we learned that under the Bolsheviks, the peasants were given the power to seize the lands from the wealthy landowners. And these peasants had small land holdings. Now, Stalin believed that small-sized peasant farms that were cultivated through traditional methods could not yield sufficient produce. So he was of this opinion that smaller the lands owned by the peasants, smaller the amount of food crops produced. And it is for this reason that Stalin now sought to introduce a new reform, a new policy in this field of agriculture. This new policy that Stalin implemented around this time came to be known as collectivization. Collectivization of farms implemented from the year 1929 entailed seizing of lands from the kulaks and organizing large-scale collective farms under state control. So, Stalin believed that these kulaks were the ones who were hoarding stocks of grains. At the same time, small land holdings were also inefficient in the production of more and more food crops. And so, under this practice called collectivization of farms, all the lands from the kulaks as well as the small-sized peasants were brought together. So, those were collectivized, so to speak. And in these large-scale collectivized farms, the peasants were now to cultivate the lands. So Stalin now felt that by collectivizing the farms, by giving birth to huge large-scale collective farms which would be under state control, the production of more and more crops could be facilitated. As a result of this, peasants were forced to cultivate in collective farms which were known as kolkhoz, and the land and implements were collectively owned and the profit earned was shared. So from this point of time, the peasants as well as the landowners were no longer in possession of either the lands or the implements. Instead, all these things were collectively owned, and those were also under direct or indirect state control. And the profit that was earned by cultivating on these large-scale collective farms was supposed to be shared among the peasants. So this is what Stalin's policy of collectivization of farms entailed. Stalin was of the opinion that it were the kulaks who used to exploit the small peasants, because the small peasants had to work and cultivate the lands which belonged to the kulaks, and the kulaks used to torture as well as exploit these peasants. So Stalin believed that organized farming on state-controlled farms would now boost agricultural production, and it would also end the kulaks' authority over the lands. But there were many very severe repercussions of this implementation of collectivization of farms. When lands, livestock as well as farming equipments went under the control of the state, the peasants were enraged, because the peasants did not really have anything for themselves. Everything they had was now owned by the state. And so these peasants were enraged by agricultural collectivization. And so they now, in a kind of protest against this implementation of collectivization of farms, they destroyed the state's livestock. And it is for this reason that between 1929 and 1931, agricultural production severely fell in the Soviet Union. Now, mind you, these peasants were not against the idea of socialism. What they were against was this agricultural collectivization, because they could profit very less from this process of agricultural collectivization. They did not have anything of their own, be that the lands, the livestock, as well as the implements which were required for cultivation. Now there were many peasants who began resisting collectivization. But Stalin was very brutal and severe and strict with his policies. So those who resisted collectivization were severely punished, deported or exiled by Stalin's government. Stalin was not a person to accept or acknowledge any kind of opposition, any kind of dissident voice. And when these peasants resisted collectivization, when they refused to work on these large-scale collective farms, then they were severely punished by Stalin's officials. They were also deported and exiled. So from this we can understand that the repression of resistance was quite severe during the rule of Stalin. Stalin believed that this idea of collectivization of farms would end up in great success. It would boost agricultural production in the Soviet Union. But Stalin's dreams of making great profit out of agricultural collectivization ended up in failure. Now we learned that the peasants were severely enraged when this collectivization of farms was implemented. The kulaks lost their authority over the lands. Even the small peasants were also affected when the agricultural production fell between 1929 and 1931. Because of the peasants' resentment and rebellions, which were coupled with bad harvest, now happened the Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933. It was one of the worst famines to happen in the history of the Soviet Union, and it costed over 4 million lives. So this is the reason why Stalin's dream of making great profit out of agricultural collectivization ended up in a great failure. Now this was a time when the masses were hungry. The famine was the worst to happen at this point of time. Political turbulence was already there in the Soviet Union because there were many groups that often threatened to destabilize the state. And at the same time, the masses, the peasants, the workers were also breaking out in rebellion and protests against the Soviet government. Now, owing to the failed policy of collectivization, confusion and criticism began spreading against the government. So much so that even the officials of the Soviet government also began contesting as well as criticizing the policies of this new Soviet government under Stalin. Now, Stalin was not a leader to accept any kind of criticism or opposition. And following this, between 1936 and 1939, Stalin now launched a brutal political campaign that was called the Great Purge. Now, the Great Purge was a kind of process of eliminating the dissident voices from the society. So all those people who criticized or contested the rule of the Soviet government were now severely punished. They were either deported or exiled, or they were even put to death under this new brutal political campaign that was called the Great Purge. The Great Purge literally means the purging of society, the cleansing of society. And this political campaign was all about removing all political opponents from the Soviet Union. So, supposed opponents of the government like the kulaks, the ethnic minorities, the religious leaders as well as the political rivals of Stalin were murdered and massacred during the Great Purge. So Stalin was trying to remove all kinds of opposition from the Soviet Union. And this policy was very brutal. And unfortunately, most of these people were innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted. With this, we come to an end of our discussion on Stalinism and collectivization. We learned that after the death of Lenin in 1924, Stalin became the new leader of the USSR. Stalin's policies were very strict and rigid. He sought to collectivize the farms in order to bring about a greater agricultural prosperity, in order to boost agricultural production in the Soviet Union. But this policy ended up in failure. The peasants revolted against the Soviet government. Agricultural production fell, which is why took place the Great Famine of 1930 to 1933. And when the masses began criticizing the Soviet government, now Stalin launched the Great Purge to remove all opponents. And this also brings us to an end of our discussion on the Russian Revolution as well. In our subsequent lesson, we will be focusing on the global influence of the USSR. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.